Welcome to Reflect, Rebuild, and Rise. The following is a presentation on the intersectional relationship between socioeconomic class and personal identity, and the way that institutionalized discrimination and marginalization permeates into our lives and interpersonal relationships. This presentation will provide a theoretical framework for these topics, then ground them into the material expression of these concepts, both in societal and interpersonal level. Questions will also be asked at the end of the presentation for the listener to reflect and answer for themselves. The small glossary contains some of the more relevant technical terminology of the presentation and practical definitions of them. Feel free to return to this section to double check any concept you might come across that doesn't seem clear enough. The idea behind cultural hegemony is that in a large and diverse society where socioeconomic inequality exists, the dominant economic class will impose its own worldview onto the rest of the society as a cultural norm. This cultural norm is then accepted and internalized by other social classes and groups. The imposition of cultural hegemony is done to serve the interests of a dominant economic class by dictating the driving values and ways of thought of a society, making sure that these beliefs and customs benefit them. This cultural hegemony explains a certain degree of compliance and homogeneity from a society's population, and those who fail to remain within this homogeneity, usually by factors outside of their control, become subalterns and are left out of the dynamics of social power. They become marginalized. Subalterns can be codified in a variety of ways, according to the specific cultural hegemony they are subjected to. Usual codifications of the subaltern include race or ethnicity, religious affiliation, national origin, linguistic differences, etc. Subalterns are also not necessarily distinct and inflexible categories. An individual's status as cultural subaltern can fluctuate depending on context, and an individual may be a subaltern in more than one way, and these subalternities will overlap. Cultural hegemony in a diverse society is a social-political process that is ever-changing and evolving in order to serve the class interests of the dominant socio-economic class, as the material conditions of that society change over time. This means that once a marginalized group is codified into the subaltern, they usually will remain a subaltern unless the existing cultural hegemony experiences a major change or is altogether destroyed. Cultural hegemony is not only an institutionalized process that exists on a higher plane, it is a process that is built on a base of everyday interactions and conversations. Cultural hegemony seeps into our own views and beliefs and maintains itself through our own biases in our own interpersonal interactions. Prejudice and discriminations are the most overt forms of bias stemming from cultural hegemony, but more subtle and less damaging forms can be expressed. Microaggressions, exotifying of the other, assumptions meant without harm but that are still carried on a basis of stereotypes. The United States, like any other country, counts with a firmly established cultural hegemony that has maintained itself since the country's beginning. The country's first established dominant socioeconomic class was made up of American and British landowners and merchants, the grand majority of whom were white Anglo-Saxon men with Protestant values. Thus, this small group set the tone for the US's original cultural hegemony. Their class interests were protected by asserting to the rest of the male white population that fought in the Revolutionary War of their own inherent superiority versus the rest of the population through racist and sexist pseudoscience. Thus, the first new subalterns of the US were codified in the black and indigenous populations and women of all standings. As history progressed, so did the expression of cultural hegemony and the subjugation of the subaltern. With the arrival of liberal democracy, women's rights movements, and liberation movements for people of color, The dominant socioeconomic class allowed for concessions and modified the existing cultural hegemony accordingly. Slavery ended but gave way to segregation, which ended but gave way to redlining and fiscal racism. Indigenous genocide was halted, but surviving natives were pushed into reservations. Women may have gained civil rights and welcomed into the workforce, but continued to face inequality and a patriarchal system. Thus, while the specific ways in which the marginalization is enforced changes, the cultural hegemony remains essentially the same. The relationship between cultural hegemony and dominant class interests is what causes this, as they are mutually dependent. As marginalized groups fight against the existing cultural hegemony and their fight grows, the interests of the dominant socioeconomic class are threatened. In order to maintain their status, the dominant class makes changes to the expressions of cultural hegemony and allows small concessions to be made to the immediate threat of these movements. However, these concessions are not large enough to completely erase existing inequalities, and instead these inequalities become more subtle or coded in a different way. This way, the cultural hegemony remains in place, allowing for the socioeconomic interests of the dominant class to be protected and vice versa. Without the influence of the dominant class interests, the cultural hegemony would erode and evolve to include those left at the margins before. And without cultural hegemony, the dominant class interests would be out in the open to be seen and threatened by anyone being marginalized by them. This is why the relationship is mutually dependent and cannot be subsided or cut from one another. Our college, for all its commitment to equality and diversity, is not exempt from the country's cultural hegemony. In fact, Bennington College can be seen as a micro-society with its own existing microcultural hegemony. The college was first founded in 1932 as a school for wealthy white women from the East Coast, and this set the tone for a micro-society's cultural hegemony. While Bennington College community has diversified slowly with time, the more institutional aspects remain aligned with the old cultural hegemony and the class interests they represented. Students of color, international students, and flow students remain subalterns within the classroom and classroom discussions. Courses revolving subalternity, such as race and gender studies or politics outside of the US, are taught by non subaltern teachers for the most part. And some aspects of the Bennington College experience, such as field trip, remain limited by financial and logistical difficulties. While the college has made very conscious efforts to address issues of institutional bias and support its diversified community, many of the issues caused by cultural hegemony in our college are not possible to be addressed on a systemic level and have to be addressed at the personal and interpersonal level. We, as members of the Bennington College community, must be in a constant state of awareness, deconstruction, and reconstruction of our college's cultural hegemony to guide its change away from marginalization of subalterns. Knowing our relationship to the college's cultural hegemony as individuals, as different forms of subalterns, or the ways in which we are privileged to not be hindered by it, is important to grow and support one another. This small list shows a few ways in which subalternity is expressed in Bennington College, but is by no means a full and comprehensive approach. Take a moment to reflect on them. Which ones are you familiar with? Which do you not know of or are unclear about? Have you or someone you know experienced any of these? What other forms of subalternity expression do you believe form part of Bennington College's cultural hegemony? Seeing as cultural hegemony is an everyday and ongoing process, so too resistance and change to it has to become an everyday pursuit, made up of both large-scale and small-scale actions. In Bennington College, there is no shortage of these kinds of actions. Small-scale actions like personal engagements between one another in the community and sensitivity training programs are an important small step, but also the creation of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as student driven affinity groups like FLOW and the International Student Task Force, have become important key players in the creation of a more inclusive atmosphere in our community. The goal of this presentation was to provide a theoretical framework that simplified the concepts of cultural hegemony and subalternity in the context of both the US and Bennington College. It is not by any means a comprehensive or nuanced analysis of cultural hegemony, its expressions in the country or the college, or the ways in which we can address issues of subalternity and marginalization. Instead, the desired goal is to leave with more questions than answers and to reflect upon these questions. Thus, the listener is encouraged to take these reflective questions as a starting point and to consider for themselves the implications raised in the presentation in their lives and the community that surrounds them.